Greetings, this is the Grumpy Old Slan, and today we're going to take a look at the October 1923 issue of Weird Tales. We have a rather nice, evocative cover. Seems to show a pirate being made to walk the plank. The only odd thing is the water seems to be more like the ship is encased in ice. We'll see what story this relates to. Remember last issue, the cover image had nothing to do with any of the stories as far as I could tell. Once again, the table of contents has been relegated near the end of the magazine. We see here that we have 12 short stories, the beginning of one serial and the end of another. We also have a nonfiction article of some sort. Now, this issue marks two important firsts in the magazine. One is H.P. Lovecraft's Dagon. It's the first appearance of a Lovecraft story in the magazine. We'll get to that one later. The other first is both in fiction and nonfiction is Seabury Quinn. He has a short story called The Phantom Farmhouse, but he also has a nonfiction piece called Weird Crimes. So again, we'll get to those later. But let us start with the first piece of fiction, which is the start of the new serial called The Amazing Adventure of Joe Scranton. This talks about the character named in the title, who meets some sort of mentalist. He is told how to astralize, have his consciousness leave his body, and he does this with a friend of his who is married to another man. He is also married. They both love their spouses. They both have intellectual interests that neither spouse participates in, so that's why they like to spend time together. Being out of their body, there cannot be any impropriety, and they find that they can travel around the world at incredible speed, see all these wonderful sights. The only problem for him, anyway, is that when he comes back, his body is freezing cold and it's unpleasant. And this mentalist suggests that he finds somebody to take his place and keep his body warm while he's away. And he finds some random person who's also left their body, who agrees to take over his body. When he comes back, he finds the other person refuses to leave his body and he's sort of stuck. He will then find the body of the other person and take it because he needs to keep that body alive so that the other can get back to it and he can get back to his. Turns out that person is a drunkard and all-round unpleasant person. And of course, when he wakes up, this person just grabs alcohol, gets drunk, mistreats the main character's wife, etc. He despairs as to what will happen, and to know what will happen, we're going to have to wait until the next issue. I think this is the kind of topic that was really popular back in the day, but today we know it's just all poppycock, if you will. It's not as engaging maybe as it could be, though the characters are quite well developed. Next we have The Phantom Farmhouse by Seabury Quinn. This is his first fiction in the magazine, and he's going to be a mainstay for quite a number of years. This is the story of a man who is recuperating from an illness in a sanatorium. And when he gets better, he can start to take walks nearby in the woods. He finds a house where an old couple live with their daughter. They're pleasant. He enjoys their company. He goes to visit regularly, falls in love with the daughter. Meanwhile, livestock in the area are getting killed by wolves or other animals. The old caretaker at the sanatorium keeps talking about the loup-garou, the werewolf, and warns him to not go to this farm and not go in the woods at night, which the main character does anyway. He will confess his love to the young girl, who asks him to come back the next day if he really loves her, and to say a prayer over 3 mounds he will find near the farm where they live. He will do this, and it will turn out that him saying the prayer will put to rest the 3 people who died there, but who couldn't move on because their bodies hadn't been properly buried. I quite like this story. It's very good. It was a very promising start in the pages of this magazine for this author. Next, as promised in the previous issue, we have Dagon by H.P. Lovecraft. This is the first fiction appearance of Lovecraft in the pages of Weird Tales. As we saw in the last issue, a letter by Lovecraft was published in the Erie. Now, Dagon, while it is his first appearance in Weird Tales, this is not the first publication of this story. It appeared 4 years previously in the November 1919 issue of The Vagrant, an amateur press publication. So I'm not going to provide a recap of this story. I suspect many of you have already read it. The Old Geek has also just put up a video of himself reading it, and I highly recommend you go and check that out. I really like this story. It's also a good introduction to the kind of fiction that Lovecraft wrote for people who've never encountered something quite like it. This is a great story and a good first appearance by Lovecraft in the pages of Weird Tales. Next, we have The Man Who Owned the World, a very short piece where the narrator runs into John Rust, who seems to be a bum, but who claims to own the entire world, to have more riches than anyone. He will invite the narrator to come and see his riches, and the man will follow and find himself in basically a slum that's filled with junk. In his delusion, the man also thinks that everybody owes him allegiance, and at one point comes into conflict. The police intervene, they arrest him. It becomes quite clear in their view that this bum isn't also delusional. But a doctor intervenes and says he can cure him, and eventually does so. And now the man leaves the hospital, goes back to his house. He still has the memory of all his riches, but when he gets there, he sees junk. This depresses him, and a few months later, he is found dead, having died of grief. The man who had once owned the world. An interesting look at insanity in the sense that rather than being horrible, it was the return to sanity that was horrible. This is another first appearance in the pages of Weird Tale by an author. Perhaps not as impressive as the 2 previous ones, but certainly nothing to be ashamed of. Quite an enjoyable tale. The Grey Sleep tells the story of a woman who is dominated by her husband, who's a very unpleasant fellow, who will prevent her from having anything that he feels is useless and doesn't add to life. And that includes things like pets or flowers, any other things that have to do with the more tender emotions. This, of course, means that she suppresses her emotions until the day when her husband, due to exposure to dust and other things at work, becomes blind. He doesn't take it well at first, but eventually he starts to accept her care more. This makes her happy until the day when a doctor says he can help her husband regain his sight, and he almost immediately starts becoming as unpleasant as he used to be. She just can't take it. She will go see an acquaintance who works in a pharmacy, and while the person is distracted, swipe something from the pharmacy. She will that night prepare tea, have him drink it. He'll feel weaker and lie down, and then she will drink a cup of the very same tea and lie down next to her husband. This was a bit of a frustrating tale. This guy's so unpleasant, you wonder why she still cares for him after 2 decades. But I guess it also means it was well written, because you do react to the 2 characters quite a bit. Another strong. Next, we have the second part of the People of the Comet. This is the serial started in the previous issue. The adventures of the spacefaring ancient astronomer king continues. He's landed on a comet. He sees a dwelling. There's a beautiful woman inside and an old man who turns out to be her father. They're alone on this comet. He will eventually fall in love with her. He will have discussions with the father, who it turns out is also an astronomer, but from another planet. And just to remind people of the weirdness of this stuff, they believe that solar systems are just gigantic atoms that make up higher matter, and that our own atoms are miniature solar systems upon which other creatures could live. He will discuss this with the old man, and it turns out that he's from another solar system entirely. They crashed on this comet and are stuck there. Eventually, the old man dies, but he's passed on some knowledge. One of the things they will do is attempt an experiment that the old man had devised but had never done. And what it does is it makes them bigger, and they actually get big enough that they can interact with the beings who are made up by the atoms that are our solar systems. And then they will shrink back down again. They will get off the comet, land on Earth, where the narrative started, where they meet an astronomer. They find out it is millions of years in the future from when they started off. Apparently, when you go into the larger dimension, time also moves much more slowly. So while they were there only a few minutes, millions of years went by on Earth. And then they have this discussion with the astronomer, and then they start to shrink down, and it looks like they will become smaller and smaller and interact with the people in the smaller dimension. And the professor of astronomy who met them, because they were in his hands while they were shrinking, they end up on his thumb. And that is why whenever people mention comets, he pulls out a microscope, looks at his thumb, hoping to maybe catch a glimpse of them or maybe getting some communication from them. These kinds of stories are imaginative. They maybe feel more imaginative because they're so far out compared to what we know of the universe. But then if you look at what people knew then, they had that field open to them. They didn't have to say, well, we're just going to pretend that what we know isn't real. In that sense, they show a weird, surreal imagination to our modern eyes. The story itself was okay at best. The framing device of the professor of astronomy didn't really add much to it, and I find his obsession with looking at his thumb doesn't work. The microscope wouldn't even get you close to atomic scales anyway, and even back in 1923, people had an idea what the atomic scale was. Next, we have The Sign from Heaven. This is about a gravedigger, and living near the cemetery where he works is an old man who most children call Old Man Simon. He's poor, he lives in a little shack. The old man takes a liking to the gravedigger's son. He told the son that when he dies, he'll take the son with him and show him a tree with golden leaves. The old man dies, is about to be buried. The gravedigger gets home. His son isn't there. He's a bit worried and starts looking for him. And he finds him apparently dancing around the open grave. By the time he gets to the grave, it turns out that his son isn't there. He just finds a small nightgown and a rose. He thinks his boy is dead and that he saw his child's ghost, so he's very worried. He runs back home, tells his wife. They start looking for their son, find him eventually, climbed up a tree, and it turns out that in the tree he found a bag that is filled with gold dollars. It is the gold coins that the old man had promised their son. It's a very short story. It feels a little bit weirdly put together to me. There's not much else for me to say about it, really, so let's move on to The Inn of Dread. This one is about two army officers who will be traveling, but one gets delayed, the other one goes ahead. They will join up again in a few days. We follow the second officer, the one who was delayed, as he starts traveling. And he is stuck. Night has started falling. It's raining. He sees a light ahead, and it turns out that it's an inn called the Bleeding Heart. He's made welcome, though he finds the place is quite strange. a few things, among others, seeing his companion's pistol hanging on a wall makes him suspicious. So when the time comes to retire, instead of going to bed, he will place a chair behind the door so that when it's opened, he won't be seen. And he's going to keep a watch. And it turns out that, yes, the people running the inn will kill their guests. He will foil the attempt to kill him. He will discover his companion's body and also the bodies of others. The sight will horrify him so much he will just run away into the night. It's okay. It certainly shows what a smart and resourceful character would do in the situation that these stories put their protagonists in. But beyond that, it's a fairly run-of-the-mill story. The Hairy Monster is a story told by a gardener about the doctor that he worked for. And the doctor would do research in a lab on his property, like a separate building. He would get along with his gardener and sometimes talk with him, preferring his company to that of others in some cases. In the few months preceding his death, the doctor was obsessed with this big experiment he was working on, only ever leaving his lab to sleep and to grab a quick bite before going back. And one of the odd things was that he was getting more and more blood delivered to the lab. No one knows why he needs so much of it, because it's gallons of them that he needs. And it will turn out that he has transformed a living being. The gardener will see what it is, a giant spider. Apparently the doctor has underestimated how much blood it will consume, so it is hungry and it will make its way out of its enclosure, kill the doctor, kill some others before making its escape. And the gardener is one of the witnesses during the investigation of what happened, and no one will believe what he saw because it's just too fantastic. An okay story. The suspense is built up nicely. We really can't guess what the creature is ahead of time. I think it's a bit of a red herring that it eats blood. I don't know of any spiders that drink blood as such. Maybe it's just my lack of knowledge. Devil Manor is a very pulpish tale of adventure involving devil worshippers. As it turns out, the leader of these worshippers is the cousin of the protagonist, who felt that the protagonist got everything that he deserved to get instead. He runs the devil cult because this is a means to try to get some lost treasure from an old member of his family that owned the manor in question, which is now pretty much abandoned otherwise. Turns out many people in the town are involved in this cult and they're doing all these awful things. Eventually, the protagonist will manage to make his escape, and as they escape, the manor will collapse in on itself, destroying the cult, losing its evil influence around it, and so on. Nothing really outstanding about it, so it wasn't particularly bad, but it wasn't particularly great either. A fun read if you're into those kinds of stories. The main protagonist of The Case of the Golden Lily is an investigator. He's a millionaire and an amateur criminologist, in the words of the story. He knows everyone, but nobody knows him. Nobody knows much about his life. Someone he knows is about to marry a dancer, and it turns out this dancer is someone that he was the patron of. When her parents died, he made sure she got a proper education and so on. This is what also lets the parents of the young man who is about to marry her know that even though she's a dancer, she's a person of good standing, good morals, etc. Part of the routine of her dance is that she holds a lily in her hands at the end of the performance, and she holds it to her face, and there's a thin electrical wire that will light up a bulb, just enough to light up her face before the curtain falls. Because she's about to marry, she's doing her last performance. Instead of doing as per script, she holds the flower up towards her fiancé, and the light, instead of lighting up, actually sort of explodes. And because she usually holds it to her face, it would have scarred her horribly. The protagonist will investigate a bit, figure out that it is the man in charge of production who has sabotaged, if you will, the electrical bulb so that it would do this, because he's in love with another dancer who is jealous of this young girl and who convinced him to do this. So this is an investigative story, but unfortunately, while the setup is quite good, we don't see the clues that will lead to the conclusion that the investigator will come to. We know who doesn't like the young girl, but beyond that, we don't have any clues as to how it was done, how he came to this conclusion, etc. There have been better efforts by other writers when it comes to this kind of story. Weird Crimes is an article by Seabury Quinn. He writes about Bluebeard, the original character from 15th century France. While it purports to be an article, sections do read like a story. You see dialogue, you see descriptions of events and actions that people take. It might be based on facts, but it does not present itself like a factual article. It was an enjoyable read. Next, we have An Adventure in the Fourth Dimension. Another one of those weird, surreal tales. A man witnesses an object fall from the sky. Some weird creatures, a huge amounts, thousands, come out of it, grow in size, and he thinks they're explorers from Mars or Venus. And this man shows up and tells him he's wrong. They're from Jupiter, and they're four-dimensionals, and that's why their spaceship can be so small, and they can fold themselves in it. And at the end of it, it turns out he had been reading a book on Einstein's theories, and he says that only 12 people in the world understand his theories, and if I'd read this book, I would be the 13th. But in a fit of madness, he was tearing the pages out, and he's kind of glad he doesn't understand these theories because it leads to things like his vision of these aliens from Jupiter. But now he has to figure out what excuse he's going to give his friend for having destroyed the book. It was kind of disappointing. It starts off like a very weird, surreal, fun little romp, but then it falls into it was all a dream, which I always find very disappointing with these stories. And now we have the fourth installment of Masterpieces of Weird Fiction, and this one is The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. So this story set during the Spanish Inquisition about a man who is captured by them and tortured with the pit and the pendulum from the title. Go read it. It's one of Poe's best and worth your time. The next story is After the Storm. This one has no real supernatural or fantastic elements to it. It's just about a young lawyer who meets up with an old college buddy of his. He doesn't have a lot of clients, so he's trying to branch out into real estate, and his friend tells him, "Oh, I have my old family manor to sell. Maybe it could interest one of your clients. We can go visit it." Eventually they do. And there they find some people are occupying it. They sort of try to deal with them, but then they find out that one of the people occupying the house is a woman. It looks like the main character's friend knows her. And what he doesn't know is that this is his friend's wife. They had a huge fight. They'd been apart for several months. And now he finds that she has just given birth to their son. They're both sorry for being so rigid in their point of view, and they get back together. And that's about it. It's just a bit of an odd tale filled with odd coincidences. Then we have The Cauldron, where people write about things that they've witnessed that are supposedly true, which I've not taken much interest in. And finally, we have The Eerie, which is the letters column. This one is mostly interesting because at the end of it, we have another letter by H.P. Lovecraft. Actually, what it looks like is several letters, and the editors took excerpts from each one and write up a bridge between each section of the letters that they published. They also promised more Lovecraft that's going to be even better than Dagon in the upcoming issues. This has been the Grumpy Old Slan, reading the October 1923 issue of Weird Tales, and I'll see you next time.